It's June 1947. We're in Patiala, Punjab, where 12-year-old Zarina Parveen clings desperately to her family within the walls of their compound. Outside, a mob bays for their blood. Each kick against the compound's gate fills young Zarina with terror, each barbed word from beyond the wall like a knife through her heart. These attackers are people Zarina once considered friends. Now, they're here to kill her and her entire family. Zarina detects a sharp, sweet scent on the breeze. Petrol. From over the wall, someone in the mob tosses a burning rag. In a flash, the entire compound is aflame. This was supposed to be a safe place. Zarina's family have already fled their home. They've come here to the centre of Patiala to take refuge with 200 other friends and family members. Now the mobs have found them, and they'll kill them too. But what crimes has Zarina committed? What have her family done to deserve this? In fact, it's quite simple. They've done nothing more than be Muslim in a Hindu and Sikh majority area of Punjab. That's enough. For that, today, they must die. As the building burns, the gate finally caves in, and the mob breaks through into the compound. They carry sticks and swords. Zarina's family is unarmed. One by one, as Zarina pleads for mercy, the Parveens and their friends are slaughtered. Zarina survives only by hiding beneath the body of her mother. That body is missing its head. Across Punjab and Bengal, people are experiencing the same horror. Some are Muslims, others are Sikhs and Hindus. It all comes down to ethnicity and location. To be the wrong ethnicity in the wrong place means death. This is the story of how hope and optimism for a new dawn gave way to hatred and fear, as boundaries were hurriedly drawn and neighbour turned against neighbour. This is the story of the partition of India. But first, today's video is sponsored by you. Literally, without our Patreon fans, we wouldn't be able to make content like this, so thank you. And if you're not there already, and you'd like to help out with the channel, and get access to uncensored versions of our more unsettling videos, then head over there and enjoy exclusive, ad-free and uncensored content, whilst also knowing you're supporting us along the way. Thank you to those that are already there, and with that, let's get back to today's video. A series of 3 elections in the mid-1940s sealed the fate for millions of people in India and Pakistan. And the first of these elections wasn't even held in India. Instead, it took place thousands of miles away in Westminster. On July 26, 1945, the triumphant Winston Churchill, still riding high after victory in Europe 6 weeks before, did the unthinkable. He lost the UK general election to the Labour Party's Clement Attlee. Churchill, a staunch opponent of Indian independence, was gone, and Attlee, who was more open to the idea, was now in power. The door was open for Indian Home Rule. But what form would this take? That December, the first Indian general election for 11 years offered a picture of what independence might look like. Abul Kalam Azad of the Indian National Congress won a majority. The INC secured 57 seats, an increase of 15 from 1934. This wasn't much of a shock, but the second place result was. Muhammad Ali Jinnah of the All India Muslim League won 30 seats, an increase of, 30, from 0 last time out. This was a huge deal. Jinnah was a supporter of partition. He believed that a Muslim state to the north and a Hindu majority state to the south was the only possible way forward. Since his resignation from the INC and his split with Mahatma Gandhi in 1920, Jinnah had spent 25 years struggling to unite his fellow Muslims under the separatist cause. But now, for the first time, he'd done it. All of the Muslim majority constituencies came out for Jinnah. None of the other constituencies did. All of this meant that a deep fissure was working its way across the Indian subcontinent. On the verge of independence, India was about to fracture into two. The third and final election came the following year. In 1946, India selected the representatives for their first constituent assembly. The INC's Jawaharlal Nehru was elected head of the government with 208 seats. Jinnah would be the minority leader of the opposition with 73. This meant that the INC would outnumber the All India Muslim League in the assembly by almost 3-1. And this was unacceptable for Jinnah. Now confident of support from India's Muslims, he and the Muslim League boycotted the assembly. The die was cast. India would achieve its independence, but would also be split into two. In the northwest and east, the country of Pakistan would emerge, and in between, the new Republic of India. Two nations would be born. Neither birth would be painless. Punjab was among the first regions to feel the effects of partition. The process of division would transform the Punjab region completely. In the north, it was mainly Muslim. Hindus and Sikhs were the minority. In the south, this was the opposite. So partition would quite literally rip the region in two. But we're still dealing with majorities and minorities here. Saying northern Punjab is Muslim and southern Punjab is not is a gross oversimplification. The reality on the ground was far more complex. Take the village of Toha Khalsa, for example. This village is in the Rawalpindi district of northern Punjab. In 1947, Rawalpindi was majority Muslim, but Toha Khalsa itself was mainly Sikh. With independence on the horizon, this was a lethal situation. In March 1947, Muslim mobs from neighbouring villages went on the rampage, targeting Toha Khalsa's Sikh community. The results were horrifying. Sikhs endured forced conversion, and their traditional beliefs were mocked and ridiculed by the violent mobs. Homes and businesses were looted and burned to the ground. Those who refused to convert were brutally beaten. Women were targeted in particular during this episode too. Many were assaulted and violated in the village that they'd always called home by the people they'd once called neighbours. 90 Sikh women, terrified by what was about to befall them, decided to take matters into their own hands. They would drown themselves, rather than submit to the atrocities unfolding around them. Among them was a young woman named Basant Kaur and her 2 children. I took my 2 children and then we jumped into the well. The well filled up and we could not drown. The children and I survived. To be clear on this, Basant had gone down the well to drown herself. She and her children only survived because this well was already choked with bodies. There simply wasn't enough water to drown them all. Elsewhere in the region, the roles were reversed. Muslims were not the perpetrators of violence, but the targets of it, as 12-year-old Zarina Parveen discovered to her horror in June 1947. Partition was still 2 months away. Tensions between ethnic groups were now at boiling point. The rioting at Rawalpindi had shocked most, but it had also excited and inspired many. It was now clear that violence of the most brutal sort could be a tool for shaping the birth of a new nation. People who were already whipped up into a religious, cultural, and nationalistic frenzy didn't need much more encouragement. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find, and they marched against their perceived enemies. This is precisely what happened in Patiala, southeastern Punjab. Here, roughly 1/3 of the population was Muslim, and this made Muslims a minority, but still a fairly sizable minority. They'd coexisted in relative harmony with Sikhs and Hindus for centuries. As Zarina herself said, before partition, our Sikh and Hindu neighbours were more like brothers and sisters. But by the summer of 1947, things had changed. The spree of violence that had taken over Rawalpindi that spring was well known by now, and the mood was tense. It was rumoured that Hindus and Sikhs would begin targeting Muslims as partition drew nearer. They would either drive them out of the region, or they would simply slaughter them. So Zarina and her family fled their home along with 200 others. But rather than fleeing Patiala altogether, they took shelter in a large building in the centre of the city. This was not enough. That June, the rumours came true. Hindu and Sikh mobs began to hunt Muslims. When they found Zarina's hiding place, they doused it in petrol and set it alight. As Zarina pleaded for them to stop, the mob burst into the building and surrounded her mother, Sharifa. They began to beat her, first with sticks and clubs, but then they drew their swords. Zarina shared what happened in her own words. My mother was beheaded in front of me. I saw it. My mother was slaughtered in front of my eyes. In the chaos, Zarina wrapped her arms around her mother's headless body as the life drained from her. Together, they fell to the floor. As we said, Zarina only survived because she was hidden by the corpse of her mother. As she lay beneath the body, her siblings, aunts and uncles were slain around her in similar ways. The pile of bodies covering Zarina became a mountain, and then the roof of the building came down. Zarina explained, I was trapped under those bodies for 3 days. There was a little airway in the rubble where I could breathe. As it turns out, it was a Sikh soldier who finally pulled Zarina from the ruins of the compound. By that point, the little girl was numb and close to death herself, her entire family gone, all alone in the world. Throughout that boiling summer of 1947, sectarian violence like this claimed 14,000 lives in Patiala alone, and many more elsewhere. Entire communities were destroyed as religious hatred swept across northern India. But there was still no line, there was still no official hard border to divide India and Pakistan. On July 18th, Attlee's government passed the Indian Independence Act, and as part of this act, the date for partition was set. At the stroke of midnight on August 15th, 1947, partition would take effect. The long-awaited line would be drawn, and people had 1 month to make sure they were on the right side of it. But even at this stage, no one knew precisely where this line would be. And this meant millions of people in Punjab and Bengal would be uncertain as to which country they would end up in. They had to make their best guess and pray that the guess was the correct one. Ending up on the wrong side of that line when the time came would be a dire situation. Panic gripped northern India as people made decisions that would spell the difference between life and death. In the northern Punjabi city of Lahore, Nilima Lamba was one of those people faced with a decision. Still only 18 years old, Nilima was a college student in Lahore, but her home district was Rawalpindi. She knew all about the atrocities at Khalsa, and as a Sikh herself in a Muslim-majority land, they chilled her to the very bone. As Nilima would later explain, I was just a schoolgirl in a place I considered my home, but it was no longer safe. Nilima's family began making plans to leave. They would make the desperate journey southeast from Rawalpindi, and they would keep going until they felt they were safe. But what about Nilima? Still in Lahore, she couldn't reach her family, so she'd have to make the journey herself. Fortunately, her father had connections in the city, and he knew the chief engineer at Lahore's railway station. Arrangements were made. The chief engineer's son, a young student named Jagjit Singh, along with his sisters, would leave Lahore with Nilima. Jagjit had a pistol with him. Nilima and his sisters believed the weapon was for their own protection, but in secret, Jagjit's father had told his son what he must do. If the situation seemed hopeless, his father said, Jagjit was to shoot his sisters and then himself. They made it aboard the crowded train, but rather than heading south or east, the train was first headed north, deeper into Muslim-majority territory. At the city of Gujranwala, around 50 miles from Lahore, they were met with an explosion of violence. In Nilima's own words, people were being murdered in cold blood in front of our eyes. We remained hidden in our cabin, too afraid to make a sound. There was a bloodbath at every stop. Nilima, Jagjit, and Jagjit's family did make it in the end, though. The terrifying journey eventually deposited them in the city of Ambala in India, and here they could begin a new life. Not everyone was so lucky. Mohindra Dal was only 6 years old when he and his Hindu family had to flee Layalpur in Pakistan. At the station, they were disappointed to find their train was full. Devastated and fearing for their lives, they watched it pull out of the station, leaving them stranded. It wasn't until the next day that they heard the news. As Mohindra recalled, the whole train was completely butchered. Half of our friends from the village who were on the train got butchered. Dr. Salim Ahmed, a Muslim, was another one of the millions who found themselves in the wrong place and with the wrong ethnicity. He managed to board a train from India to Pakistan, but witnessed horrendous scenes on the journey. At one point, a gang tried to drag Muslims from the train. They said, "Muslim, Muslim, Muslim," and took the women and started hitting them. This started the massacre. Little children, they took them and bang, they killed them with a sword. The women were crying, my child, but we couldn't help them. Dr. Salim said the only reason he survived the ordeal was because he was able to pretend that he was a Christian. Of course, not everyone was purely a victim here. For there to be victims of violence, there must also be perpetrators of violence. Ghulam Malik Rabbani was only 12 when he became one of those perpetrators. He joined up with a band of Muslim youths, eager to exact revenge on the Hindus that they believed to be their enemies. But the violence was a bit more than Ghulam had bargained for. He remembered that the gang tried to force his 18-year-old brother to murder an old woman and her grandson. Ghulam's brother, realizing then how serious the situation had become, refused. This didn't really matter. That lady was killed by another person in front of us. Across Punjab and Bengal, unspeakable acts were committed by those who had become swept up in the sudden release of ethnic tensions. Sudden seems to be the key word here. Witnesses speak of communities that existed side by side for centuries who suddenly found themselves at each other's throats, basically overnight. This is not to say that tensions hadn't existed before, they almost certainly had, but this explosion of violence on this kind of scale was unprecedented. So why did all of this happen so quickly? After all, the Indian independence movement had been gathering momentum for decades, and even the younger Pakistan movement was at least 7 years old. So why were these final weeks played out with such breakneck urgency, as if the entire thing had just been decided out of the blue? As with most things in history, there are several different factors at play here, and one of the biggest was planning. When Lord Mountbatten was sworn in as the last Viceroy of India in March 1947, rioting was already underway in Rawalpindi, and there were other mass disturbances in Mumbai and Delhi. Mountbatten took this as a sign that he needed to act quickly, and though he was advised that the transition should be gradual, Mountbatten wasn't having any of that. Fast-tracked independence, he felt, would bring an end to violence. So Mountbatten needed someone who could draw up a new map of India and do it quickly. Sir Cyril Radcliffe was deemed to be the man for the job. And this was a bit of a strange choice, really, as Radcliffe had never travelled further east than Paris and knew nothing of the ethnic makeup of northern India. All the same, though, he had 5 weeks to split the country in two, with Muslims in the north and Sikhs and Hindus in the south. This meant drawing a line right through Punjab and Bengal and chopping these regions in half. So Radcliffe delivered his line, and the colonial authorities had their border. From midnight on August 15th, 1947, the separation was in effect. And yet still, no one knew where the border was. The line was still undisclosed, and it would remain so for another 48 hours. For 2 whole days after India and Pakistan split, tens of millions of people had no idea what country they were in. And this was no accident. The colonial authorities weren't keen on the idea of millions of people racing for the border on India's much-vaunted Independence Day. They wanted to end things on a positive note, with celebrations and joy, not bloodshed and death. That bloodshed and death could wait until August 17th. When the border was finally announced, around 14 million people found out that they were on the wrong side of the line. Roughly 7 million Muslims and the same number of Sikhs and Hindus scrambled to swap places. They set out on dangerous journeys as violence ripped across the region. The lowest estimates say 200,000 people were killed. The highest put this at 2 million. But to be fair on Radcliffe, he quickly recognised he'd made a mistake, and as a result, refused to accept his £3,000 fee. He did not, however, refuse his OBE, which came the following year. But while this explains the massive displacement, it doesn't really explain the violence. Why did communities turn on one another so quickly, and why were such inhumane acts carried out in places like Rawalpindi and Patiala? One possible reason for this is underlying ethnic tensions. While both Nilima Lamba and Zarina Parveen talk of harmony between communities, this may not have been the case everywhere. Sectarian and ethnic violence had occurred in India long before the colonial period, although it was admittedly rare. These tensions had been stoked under British rule, though. Colonial authorities introduced the idea of martial races, ethnic groups who were physically or morally superior. These ethnic groups would be treated with greater respect and greater humanity than others. Sometimes martial status would be rescinded, and this happened to both the Marathi and the Nair peoples. Feelings of resentment and injustice festered as a result. And as the independence movement gathered pace, these feelings came to the surface, despite Gandhi's efforts to unite all of India against the spectre of colonialism. During Gandhi's first nationwide campaign of non-violent resistance in 1930, Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims all came out together in support of independence. At Kisakwani in Peshawar, a Muslim group followed Gandhi's doctrine of disobedience to the letter. They ignored provocations and would not be drawn into violence. Enraged, the British Indian Army drove 2 armoured cars up to the protest lines. But these armoured cars did not stop there. They smashed into the crowd at high speed, causing massive injuries. When the crowd still didn't disperse, the BIA opened fire. The Muslim Peshawari protesters maintained their vow of non-violence and fell in their scores. Official BIA figures say 20 were killed. Other sources say 400. In the years following the Kisakwani massacre, Muslim support for Gandhi's non-violent resistance dwindled. It's not clear whether this was a direct result of the Peshawari's treatment at the hands of the BIA or for another reason, but whatever the cause, the result was the same: a growing divide between Muslims and their Hindu and Sikh compatriots. It took Jinnah more than a decade to capitalise on this divide. Though Muslims seemed to be turning away from Gandhi, they weren't necessarily turning to Jinnah and his ideas of partition. But when Jinnah finally united Indian Muslims in 1945, there was no way back. Festering resentment was about to erupt into full-scale violence. Another factor was the sudden withdrawal of British control, which left a power vacuum. Military units and colonial police forces, which had once enforced law and order, simply vanished in many places. As millions of people made their perilous journeys, they did so through lawless territories in which society was close to breaking down. Every decision these migrants made was a gamble, and at stake were their own lives and the lives of their family members. Finally, some nefarious actors seemed only too happy to exploit the chaotic situation, as the historian Mithili Srinivas tells us. The Punjab in particular was awash with weapons and recently demobilised soldiers who had fought in World War II. Some formed paramilitary groups, often funded by local landowners and other elites, who used the chaos of partition to settle old scores, assert claims over land, and secure their own political and economic power. This intricate network of factors left both India and Pakistan in a precarious situation. In October, while the disaster of partition was still unfolding, India and Pakistan went to war over the Jammu and Kashmir region. This year-long conflict would see thousands dead and begin a territorial dispute that remains unresolved almost 8 decades later. The total number of dead in Indo-Pakistani clashes may be more than 100,000. The most recent clash took place in May 2025. Pakistan also experienced a further split of its own in 1971 when East Pakistan gained independence. The Bangladeshi War of Liberation left tens of thousands of soldiers dead and may have killed as many as 3 million civilians, although experts believe 500,000 might be closer to the truth. Partition was a humanitarian disaster. While most of the bloodshed was over by the end of 1948, the effects are still with us today. In some ways, it provided a grim coda to the centuries of British colonial rule in India. While Lord Mountbatten and Cyril Radcliffe did not intend for hundreds of thousands to die, it could be argued they didn't really do enough to stop this from happening. They seemed much more concerned with getting the job done quickly and getting out of there than with protecting the welfare of millions of people in India and Pakistan. This is par for the course when it comes to Britain's attitudes towards India. From the very beginning of the East India Company in the 17th century, Britain treated the subcontinent with contempt. British businessmen and colonial administrators siphoned off India's wealth and subjugated its people. Through the idea of the martial race, they created an ethnic hierarchy, stoking tensions and fracturing India's cultural bedrock. Mismanagement of agriculture and logistics networks also led to famines that left tens of millions dead. Of the Madras famine in 1781, Dutch observer Jakob Hafner had this to say: "I observed the English passing by, and saw no trace of compassion on the face of any of them, for the innumerable wailing beings lying on the ground before them. Even worse, I saw their ladies, those sentimental, tender-hearted creatures, sit in their palanquins with the same cool indifference when they were carried right through this battlefield." Of the Bengal famine in 1943, Winston Churchill offered his own view. "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits." And this is before we consider the out-and-out murders. At Ajnala in 1857, 282 Bengali mutineers were drowned in a well. The massacre was kept secret for more than 150 years. In 1919, the Amritsar massacre killed at least 379 and wounded more than 1,000 others. And then there was the Kissaquami massacre in 1930, and the killings at Allahabad, Kanpur, Malakotla, Mangad. The list goes on and on. Partition may have brought colonial control to an end, but it did so in the most harrowing of ways. In the birth pains of two new nations, hundreds of thousands lost their lives and millions endured traumas that would stay with them forever. But before we finish, I'd like to pick back up with some of the people that we've met along the way. When we left 12-year-old Zarina, she was all alone in Patiala. She'd lain there for 3 days with the bodies of her family members while they decomposed in the summer heat. Finally, she was rescued by a Sikh soldier. Zarina was then taken to a refugee camp, and here, by a stroke of good fortune, Zarina discovered that one of her aunts was still alive. For months, Zarina and her aunt helped each other to survive, and finally, in January 1948, they were transported across the border and into Lahore. Zarina would settle in Lahore, marrying a Pakistani journalist. She never forgot her experiences in Patiala that summer. The atrocities she witnessed robbed her of her childhood innocence, something she would never get back. When we last heard from Nilima Lamba, she'd reunited with her family in Ambala, India. Nilima settled there, eventually marrying Jagjit, who became a decorated member of the Indian Air Force. They would later move to England, enjoying a happy retirement until Jagjit's death in 2020. When Nilima was interviewed by the Guardian newspaper in 2023, she was 93 years old and living in Northwood, just outside London. She never went back to her childhood home of Rawalpindi, nor to the city of Lahore, where she once attended college. The horror of partition made this too difficult and too painful. But even after all this, Nilima still tries to focus on the positives. Though Jagjit and I never returned to Pakistan, I will always remember it as the place where we first met and where our story began.